Wei Jiang was practically invisible at Westridge University, not because he was trying to hide, but because no one bothered to look. He walked through the crowded hallways with his shoulders slightly hunched, his backpack hanging off one shoulder, and his eyes fixed on the path ahead. Students brushed past him without a second glance, professors nodded absently when checking attendance, and even the cafeteria staff rarely remembered his usual order. Wei wasn't from around here. He'd grown up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business, where his parents ran a modest convenience store, working from dawn until well past sunset. They had sacrificed everything to send their only son to this prestigious university. "Education is the only ladder," his father would say, his hands rough from years of manual labor but gentle when ruffling Wei's hair. The campus of Westridge University sprawled across several acres of manicured lawns and imposing brick buildings. In the fall, the trees turned brilliant shades of orange and red, and students gathered in noisy groups beneath them. Wei often sat alone, watching them from a distance, a textbook open on his lap but his mind far away. "You don't belong here," a voice in his head whispered sometimes, not because anyone had ever said those exact words to him, but because everything about this place, from the wealthy students discussing their summer homes to the professors referencing cultural touchstones he'd never experienced, reminded him how different he was. We lived in the cheapest dormitory on campus, sharing a cramped room with 3 other scholarship students who were rarely there. He kept his space meticulously tidy, his clothes folded precisely, his books arranged by subject. Order was comforting when everything else felt chaotic. His schedule was as orderly as his living space. Breakfast at 6:30 a.m. in the nearly empty cafeteria, morning classes, lunch spent in the library studying, afternoon classes. Dinner grabbed quickly before heading to his part-time job shelving books in the university library, and then studying until his eyes burned and the words began to blur on the page. Most of Wei's classes were challenging but manageable. He maintained excellent grades without drawing attention to himself, preferring to submit assignments early and slip out of class before the professor could comment on his work. But there was one class that was different: Advanced Theoretical Mathematics with Dr. Eleanor Harmon. Dr. Harmon wasn't like the other professors. She was younger, for one thing, and she taught with an infectious enthusiasm that made even the most abstract concepts feel tangible. Her dark hair was usually tied back in a messy bun, and she had a habit of gesturing wildly when explaining complex theories, sometimes accidentally sending chalk flying across the room, which always made the class laugh. During the 3rd week of class, Dr. Harmon posed a question that stumped everyone. The silence stretched uncomfortably as students avoided eye contact, hoping someone else would answer. We knew the solution, had known it almost immediately, but his throat tightened at the thought of speaking up. Finally, heart-pounding, he raised his hand halfway. "Yes, Wei, right?" Dr. Harmon said, her eyes lighting up. Wei nodded and softly explained his approach to the problem. The room remained silent, but this time it wasn't from confusion but surprise. Dr. Harmon's smile widened as he spoke. "That's exactly right," she said when he finished. "In fact, that's an elegant solution I hadn't considered." "Very impressive." The moment passed quickly. Class continued, and no one mentioned Wei's contribution afterward. But something had shifted. Dr. Harmon began to watch for his half-raised hand calling on him even when others had their hands up. Sometimes she'd leave comments on his homework that went beyond the usual check marks and corrections. "This is graduate-level thinking," or, "Have you considered pursuing research in this area?" We kept these notes in a drawer beside his bed. On nights when the loneliness pressed in like a physical weight, he would read them again, allowing himself a small measure of pride. One evening in late October, Wei was working his usual shift at the library when he overheard 2 senior students talking excitedly about Renault's problem. "Professor." Renault posted it on the main whiteboard in the math department, one of them said. "He said he'll give special recognition to anyone who can solve it. Not that anyone will. It's stumped mathematicians for decades." "I heard a team at MIT has been working on it for years," the other replied. "No way some undergrad is going to crack it." Wei shelved the books he was carrying and took a detour past the mathematics department on his way back to his dorm. The hallway was empty, but the whiteboard they'd mentioned dominated one wall. Equations covered its surface in precise, elegant handwriting. Wei stood before it, forgetting his usual self-consciousness as he absorbed the problem. It was beautiful in its complexity. Wei could see why it had captivated so many minds over the years. He took out his phone and snapped a picture before continuing to his dorm, the equation still dancing in his mind. That night, instead of completing his assigned readings, Wei filled page after page of his notebook with attempts at Renault's problem. When his roommates returned, laughing and smelling of beer, he quietly packed up his work and retreated to the communal study lounge at the end of the hall. The next day, Wei was distracted in all his classes. Even in Dr. Harmon's class, he barely participated, his mind still working through variations of Renault's equations. After dinner, he returned to the whiteboard to stare at the problem again, making sure he'd remembered it correctly. A few other students were there doing the same thing, some taking notes, others shaking their heads in defeat. "Waste of time," one of them muttered. "Renault just wants to remind us how smart he is and how dumb we are." Professor Renault was the head of the mathematics department, a stern man in his 60s with a reputation for brilliant research and brutal grading. Wei had never taken a class with him, but his name was spoken with a mixture of awe and fear among mathematics students. For the next 2 weeks, Wei's notebooks filled with calculations related to Renault's problem. He tried conventional approaches first, then began exploring unorthodox methods. He slept less, ate infrequently, and spoke even more rarely than usual. Even Dr. Harmon noticed his distraction. "Everything okay, Wei?" she asked after class one day, genuine concern in her voice. "Yes, Professor," he replied, surprised by her attention. "Just thinking about a problem." "Well, don't think yourself into exhaustion," she said with a small smile. "Sometimes the brain needs rest to make breakthroughs." But Wei couldn't rest. The problem had sunk its hooks into him, becoming almost a companion in his solitude. While other students prepared for Halloween parties and midterm exams, Wei filled notebook after notebook with equations, crossing out failed attempts but always starting again. The breakthrough came at an unexpected moment. Wei was in the shower, hot water running over his tired shoulders, when a completely new approach occurred to him. It was so simple, so elegant, that he couldn't believe no one had tried it before. He rushed through rinsing off, threw on clothes, and practically ran to his desk to test his theory. Hours passed as he worked feverishly, hardly aware of his surroundings. When the first light of dawn crept through his window, Wei had filled 30 pages with calculations, each building on the last, leading inevitably toward a solution. His hands were stained with ink, his eyes red from lack of sleep, but his mind was clearer than it had been in weeks. Wei needed to see the original problem again, to check his work against Professor Renault's exact formulation. The campus was quiet at this early hour as he made his way to the mathematics building, clutching his notebooks to his chest. The door was unlocked. The security guard must have started his rounds on the other side of campus. Wei stood alone before the whiteboard, comparing his notes to the written problem. Everything matched up. His heart began to race as he realized what he had done. For a moment, Wei hesitated. What if he was wrong? What if he had made a fundamental error that would be obvious to someone like Professor Renault? The thought of public ridicule made his stomach clench. Perhaps it would be better to say nothing, to tuck his notebooks away and pretend he had never attempted the problem. But another voice in his mind, one that sounded strangely like Dr. Harmon, urged him forward. If he was right, if he had actually solved Renault's problem, shouldn't the solution be shared? With trembling hands, Wei picked up a marker. He began to write, slowly at first, then with growing confidence. His solution filled the empty space beside the original problem, his normally neat handwriting made larger and more rushed by excitement. When he finished, Wei stood back and looked at his work. In the silent, dimly lit hallway, with no one to witness it, he allowed himself a small smile. "What are you doing?" Wei spun around to find the night janitor watching him with suspicion, a mop clutched in his weathered hands like a weapon. I was just..." Wei gestured helplessly at the whiteboard. The janitor squinted at the equations. "You're not supposed to mess with the professor's work, son." "I wasn't messing with it," Wei said quietly. "I was solving it." The janitor looked skeptical but shrugged. "Well, that's between you and the math folks. I'm just here to clean the floors, not the boards." He moved on down the hallway, leaving Wei alone again. We looked once more at his work, doubt creeping back in. He should erase it, pretend this never happened. But as he reached for the eraser, a strange sense of defiance took hold. For once in his life, Wei decided to be seen. He placed the marker carefully back in the tray, gathered his notebooks, and walked out of the building into the brightening day. Behind him, the whiteboard stood as silent testimony to what the quiet kid had done, waiting to shock the entire university when the first classes of the morning began. The mathematics building was always eerily quiet at night. Most students avoided it after hours, preferring the livelier atmosphere of the campus center or their dorm common rooms. But for Wei, the silence was comforting. It gave him space to think without the constant reminder that he didn't quite fit in. That night had been particularly rough. Earlier in the day, Wei had overheard two classmates discussing weekend plans at a lake house that one of them owned. They'd fallen silent when they noticed him nearby, then awkwardly invited him along in a way that made it clear the invitation was merely politeness. Wei had mumbled something about having work to do and hurried away, cheeks burning with embarrassment. Now at 2 a.m., the mathematics building belonged to him alone. The security guard, a friendly older man named Ray who knew Wei from his late-night study sessions, had nodded him through with a casual, "Don't stay too late, kid. Even brains need sleep." Wei wandered the empty hallways, his footsteps echoing against the tiled floors. He wasn't looking for anything in particular, just a quiet place to escape his thoughts. But his feet carried him inevitably toward the main hall where Professor Renault's infamous equation still dominated the whiteboard. For weeks, students and faculty had been buzzing about the problem. It had become something of a campus legend, with rumors circulating that it was actually unsolvable, that Renault had posed it as a sort of cosmic joke on the department. We had heard that graduate students were spending entire weekends attempting to crack it, that a group of senior faculty had a weekly meeting dedicated solely to discussing possible approaches. Standing before it now, in the dim light of the hallway's nighttime security settings, Wei felt an unexpected calm wash over him. Math had always been his refuge. Numbers didn't care where he came from or how he dressed or whether he knew the right things to say at parties. They simply existed, waiting patiently for someone to understand them. Wei sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling a notebook from his backpack. He hadn't come here intending to work on Renault's problem again, but now that he was here, he felt drawn to it. His earlier attempts had ended in frustration, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the late hour, or the absolute quiet, or simply the fact that he had nothing to lose. He began by reviewing the problem itself, really looking at it instead of immediately trying to solve it. Professor Renault's handwriting was precise and elegant, each symbol perfectly formed. The equation was complex but beautiful in its way, like a challenging piece of music. As Wei stared at it, he began to see connections he'd missed before. It was as if the problem itself was speaking to him, revealing its secrets in the silent darkness. He started writing rapidly, his pencil scratching against the paper. Time became meaningless. We filled page after page, occasionally standing to pace in small circles before returning to his work. At some point, he set aside his notebook and began writing directly on the whiteboard, filling the empty space around Renault's original problem. It was during one of these moments, as he reached to write a particularly crucial step in his developing solution, that something clicked in his mind, a connection he hadn't seen before, a path through the mathematical maze that had been hidden in plain sight. Wei's hand froze mid-air, his marker hovering just above the board. "That's it," he whispered into the empty room. His heart began to race as he worked faster, his writing becoming less neat as excitement took over. He was vaguely aware that he was making a mess of the board, but he couldn't stop to reorganize his thoughts. Everything was flowing now, each step leading logically to the next, the solution unfurling before him like a flower opening to the sun. When Wei finally wrote the last symbol, completing his proof, he stepped back and stared at his work in disbelief. Had he really just solved the problem that had stumped the best minds in the department? It seemed impossible, and yet the math didn't lie. He checked and rechecked his work, following each step of his reasoning, but could find no flaws. Exhaustion suddenly hit him like a physical blow. Wei slumped into a nearby chair, his body finally registering that he had been working for hours without rest. He rested his head on his arms, intending to close his eyes for just a moment. The next thing Wei knew, someone was gently shaking his shoulder. "Hey, son. Wake up." Wei blinked awake, disoriented. The janitor, an older man with salt and pepper hair and kind eyes, was standing over him. a concerned expression on his weathered face. "You been here all night?" the janitor asked, glancing at the papers strewn around Wei and then at the whiteboard. He whistled low. "What did you do to Professor Renault's board?" Wei sat up straighter, suddenly fully awake. He turned to look at the whiteboard and felt a jolt of alarm. In his late-night frenzy, he had covered nearly the entire surface with his workings, leaving only Renault's original problem untouched. I was working on the problem," Wei said, his voice hoarse from sleep and lack of use. The janitor, his name tag read Henry, shook his head. "Well, I hope you got a picture of all that, because I've got orders to clean these boards every morning." Panic flared in Wei's chest. "No, please don't erase it. It's important. I think I solved it." Henry raised an eyebrow. "Solved what?" "Professor Renault's problem. The one everyone's been talking about." The janitor looked skeptical but shrugged. "Above my pay grade, kid. But tell you what, I'll leave this board alone. Let the math folks sort it out." He gestured to Wei's disheveled appearance. "You might want to clean yourself up, though. First classes start in about an hour." Wei glanced at his watch and was shocked to see it was nearly 7 a.m. He had been in the mathematics building for almost 5 hours. Hastily, he gathered his scattered notes, stuffing them into his backpack. "Thank you," he said to Henry, who was already moving down the hall with his cleaning cart. "Don't mention it," the janitor called over his shoulder, "and maybe try sleeping in a bed next time." Wei hurried to the nearest bathroom to splash water on his face and attempt to make himself presentable. His reflection in the mirror showed a tired young man with dark circles under his eyes and hair sticking up in odd directions. He did his best to smooth it down and straighten his rumpled clothes. As he left the bathroom, he heard voices coming from the direction of the main hall, early arrivals for the day's first classes. Wei hesitated, suddenly unsure. Should he stay and explain his work on the board? Or should he slip away and pretend he had nothing to do with it? The thought of facing Professor Renault and potentially being ridiculed for his presumption made Wei's stomach churn. But the alternative, letting someone else take credit for his solution, or worse, having it erased before anyone understood what he'd done, was equally unpalatable. In the end, his exhaustion made the decision for him. Wei needed sleep, a shower, and a change of clothes before he could face any potential confrontation. He took a different exit from the building, avoiding the main hall, and made his way back to his dormitory through the quiet morning campus. By the time Wei returned to his room, his roommates had already left for their morning classes. He set an alarm to wake him for his afternoon session with Dr. Harmon, then collapsed onto his bed, still fully clothed. Wei slept deeply, his body making up for the night's exertions. When his alarm finally blared, he felt groggy but somewhat restored. He showered quickly, changed into fresh clothes, and headed to class, trying not to think about what might be happening in the mathematics department. Dr. Harmon's class was usually the highlight of Wei's week, but today he found it hard to concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to the whiteboard covered in his frantic scribbles. Had anyone understood what he'd done? Did they know it was his work? Did it even matter, Wei? "Are you with us today?" Dr. Harmon's voice broke through his distraction. The entire class had turned to look at him, and Wei realized she must have asked him a question. "I'm sorry, Professor," he said, his voice barely audible. "Could you repeat that?" Dr. Harmon gave him a curious look but repeated her question about eigenvalues. Wei answered correctly, relieved that his mathematical instincts functioned even when his mind was elsewhere. But Dr. Harmon continued to glance at him throughout the remainder of the class, clearly aware that something was off about her usually attentive student. As the class filed out at the end of the session, Dr. Harmon called out, "Wei, could you stay for a moment, please?" Wei's heart sank. He approached her desk slowly, bracing himself for a reprimand about his inattention. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Harmon asked, her voice gentle. "You seem distracted today." "I'm fine," Wei said automatically. "Just didn't sleep well." Dr. Harmon studied him for a moment, then said, "Have you heard the news? The mathematics department is in quite an uproar this morning." Wei felt the blood drain from his face. "What news?" "Someone solved Renault's problem. Left the entire solution on the board overnight. No name, no explanation, just the completed proof." Wei swallowed hard. "Oh." "The strange thing is," Dr. Harmon continued, watching him closely, "the approach is unconventional. Brilliant, but not something you'd expect from any of our graduate students or faculty. Renaud is beside himself, half convinced it's correct and half certain there must be an error somewhere. And what do you think? Wei asked, his heart pounding so loudly he was sure she must hear it. Dr. Harmon smiled slightly. I think whoever solved it has an exceptional mind, and I think they must have their reasons for not signing their work. She paused, then added casually, the handwriting is quite distinctive, you know. Wei's eyes widened. Did she recognize his handwriting from his assignments? Before he could respond, Dr. Harmon picked up a stack of papers and began organizing them. Well, I won't keep you any longer. Get some rest, Wei. You look like you need it. Wei nodded mutely and turned to leave. At the door, he hesitated and looked back. Dr. Harmon was still watching him, a knowing expression on her face. She gave him a small nod, and Wei felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Someone knew. Someone understood what he had done. The news had spread across campus by dinner time. Wei heard snippets of conversation everywhere he went, in the cafeteria, in the library, even in the usually quiet study rooms. Everyone was talking about the mysterious solution and speculating about who could have done it. I bet it was Professor Chen from physics, one student said confidently. She's been working on related problems for years. No way, another countered. It has to be someone from outside the university, maybe a visiting scholar. No one suggested it might be an undergraduate, much less a quiet scholarship student who barely spoke in class. Wei found himself in the strange position of being simultaneously invisible and the center of attention. That evening, as Wei was eating a solitary dinner in a corner of the cafeteria, his phone buzzed with a campus-wide email. He opened it to find a message from Professor Renaud himself. To the Westridge University community, this morning a complete solution to the theoretical problem I posed last month was discovered on the main whiteboard in the mathematics building. After careful review by myself and several colleagues, I can confirm that the solution is correct and represents a significant mathematical achievement. The author of this solution has not yet come forward. I invite them to contact me directly to discuss their work and receive proper recognition. A photograph of the original board has been preserved and will be displayed in the department until further notice. Sincerely, Professor Julien Renaud, Chair, Department of Mathematics. Wei stared at the email, his dinner forgotten. Professor Renaud was confirming his solution was correct. The most renowned mathematician at the university was inviting him to come forward, but could he? The thought of stepping into the spotlight, of having everyone's attention focused on him, made Wei's chest tighten with anxiety. He had solved the problem because it fascinated him, because the mathematics spoke to him in a way people rarely did. He hadn't done it for recognition or acclaim. And yet a small voice inside him whispered, wouldn't it be nice to be seen, truly seen, just once? Wei put away his phone and finished his meal in silence, his mind racing with possibilities. He had a decision to make, and for perhaps the first time in his life he wasn't entirely sure what the right answer was. The mathematics department had never seen such excitement. Students crowded the hallway, jostling for position to see the now famous whiteboard, where the mysterious solution remained untouched, protected by a makeshift barrier of chairs, arranged by Henry the janitor. Professors huddled in small groups, speaking in low, intense voices, occasionally pointing at specific sections of the proof, with expressions ranging from disbelief to admiration. Wei observed all this from a distance, slipping past the crowds, with his head down, his heart racing every time he heard someone mention the solution or Renaud's problem. 3 days had passed since that fateful night, and still no one suspected him. It felt surreal, like watching a movie about someone else's life. His phone had become a source of anxiety. Every few hours, Professor Renaud sent another email to the university community, each more urgent than the last, asking the anonymous solver to come forward. The latest message had hinted at a special ceremony and possible scholarship opportunities, which only increased Wei's turmoil. His family could certainly use the financial help, but the thought of standing in front of the entire university made his palms sweat and his breath catch in his throat. On the 4th day, As Wei was hurrying across campus to his morning class, trying to avoid the ongoing discussions about the mathematical mystery, a hand touched his shoulder. He jumped, nearly dropping his books. "Sorry to startle you," said Dr. Harmon, her expression kind but serious. "Do you have a moment to talk?" Wei nodded, unable to form words. Dr. Harmon led him to a quiet bench beneath a sprawling oak tree, its leaves turning golden in the autumn sunlight. "I was reviewing some of your past assignments last night," she began, her voice casual but her eyes intent on his face. "You have a very distinctive approach to problem-solving, Wei. Creative, unconventional." She paused, then added softly, "Rather like the solution on Renault's board." Wei looked down at his hands, which had begun to tremble slightly. This was it. She knew. "I'm not here to pressure you," Dr. Harmon continued. "If you want to remain anonymous, that's your choice, and I'll respect it." She hesitated, then placed a gentle hand on his arm. "But I want you to know that what you did was remarkable, and sometimes, Wei, it's okay to let your light shine." Wei finally looked up, meeting her gaze. "I never meant to solve it," he said quietly, admitting his involvement for the first time. "It just happened." Dr. Harmon smiled. "The best discoveries often do." "I don't know what to do now," Wei confessed. "I'm not good with attention." "I understand," Dr. Harmon said. "But consider this. Your solution isn't just a personal achievement. It's a contribution to our collective understanding. And beyond that," she looked around the campus where students walked in laughing groups or sat studying in patches of sunlight. "This university could use a reminder that brilliance doesn't always announce itself loudly." Wei sat silently, absorbing her words. For the first time, he allowed himself to imagine what it might be like to be known, to have his work recognized. The thought was both terrifying and strangely appealing. "I have a meeting with Professor Renault this afternoon," Dr. Harmon said, standing up. "If you'd like, you could join me. No pressure, no grand announcements, just a conversation." She gave him a reassuring smile. "Think about it. My office at 3. As Dr. Harmon walked away, Wei remained on the bench, his mind swirling with possibilities. The thought of facing Professor Renault made his stomach clench with anxiety. But a new feeling was emerging alongside the fear, a tentative pride in what he had accomplished. Wei spent the rest of the morning in a daze, barely hearing his professor's lectures, his decision weighing heavily on his mind. When lunchtime came, he found a quiet corner of the library and called his parents, something he rarely did during the week. His mother answered, her voice warm with surprise. "Wei, is everything okay? You never call on Tuesdays." "Everything's fine, Mom," Wei said, then hesitated. How could he explain what was happening? I did something. Something good, I think." He told them in halting sentences about the problem and his solution, carefully explaining the significance in terms they would understand. When he finished, there was a brief silence. "My son," his father said finally, his voice thick with emotion. "We always knew you were special. But now everyone might know," Wei said, voicing his fear. "If I tell them it was me." "And this scares you?" his mother asked gently. "Yes." "Wei," his father said, "when I was your age, I had a chance to enter a cooking competition. My dumplings were the best in our town. Everyone said so. But at the last minute, I was too afraid to put my name on the list. For years, I wondered what might have happened if I had been braver." Wei had never heard this story before. His father, always so practical and steadfast, rarely spoke of regrets. "What I'm trying to say," his father continued, "is that sometimes the things that scare us most are the doors to our future. You have opened this door with your mind. Now you must decide if you will walk through it." After the call ended, Wei sat still, his father's words echoing in his thoughts. He checked his watch. 2:30 p.m., 30 minutes to decide. At precisely 3 p.m., there was a soft knock on Dr. Harmon's office door. She opened it to find Wei standing there, pale but resolute. "I'll come with you," he said simply. Dr. Harmon's face broke into a warm smile. I'm glad. They walked together to the mathematics building, Dr. Harmon chatting casually about an interesting paper she'd been reading, giving Wei space to gather his courage. As they approached Professor Renault's office, Wei's steps slowed involuntarily. He's just a person, Dr. Harmon said quietly. A brilliant mathematician, yes, but still just a person. And between you and me... She leaned closer, lowering her voice to a conspiratorial whisper. He's been absolutely stumped by your solution. It's good for him. This unexpected comment startled a small laugh from Wei, easing the tightness in his chest just as Dr. Harmon knocked on the heavy wooden door. Enter, called a deep voice from within. Professor Renault's office was exactly as Wei had imagined it, walls lined with bookshelves overflowing with mathematical texts, a large desk covered in papers, and a blackboard filled with equations. The professor himself was a tall, thin man with silver hair and piercing blue eyes that widened slightly when he saw Wei standing beside Dr. Harmon. Eleanor, he greeted Dr. Harmon, then turned his gaze to Wei. And you are? This is Wei Zhang, Dr. Harmon said, one of our undergraduate scholarship students. He's here about the solution to your problem. Professor Renault's expression sharpened with interest. Indeed, does he know who solved it? Dr. Harmon glanced at Wei, giving him the space to speak for himself. Wei took a deep breath. I did, he said, his voice quiet but steady. I solved it. For a moment, Professor Renault simply stared at him, his face unreadable. Then abruptly, he stood and walked to a filing cabinet in the corner of the office. He pulled out a folder and returned to his desk. Your student ID, please, he said, his tone neutral. Wei fumbled in his pocket for his university ID card and handed it over. Professor Renault compared the photo to Wei's face, then opened the folder, which Wei now saw contained printouts of his solution from the whiteboard. Write out the key steps of your approach, Professor Renault instructed, pushing a blank piece of paper across the desk along with a pen. Wei looked at Dr. Harmon, who nodded encouragingly. He took the pen and began to write, his initial nervousness fading as he immersed himself in the mathematics. This at least was familiar territory. This he knew how to do. As Wei wrote, Professor Renault watched intently, occasionally making a soft sound or nodding slightly. When Wei finished, the professor picked up the paper and compared it to the printouts, his eyes moving rapidly between them. After what seemed like an eternity, Professor Renault set the papers down and looked at Wei, his expression transformed by a mixture of surprise and reluctant respect. It seems we have our mysterious mathematician, he said. An undergraduate extraordinary. Wei felt a wave of relief wash over him, followed by a strange, unfamiliar feeling that took him a moment to identify. Pride. Not just any undergraduate, Dr. Harmon interjected. One of the brightest minds I've encountered in my teaching career. Professor Renault's gaze remained fixed on Wei. Your solution isn't just correct, Mr. Zhang. It's elegant. More importantly, it approaches the problem from an angle I've never seen before. Where did you learn this technique? I didn't, Wei admitted. It just seemed like the right way to tackle it. Professor Renault's eyebrows shot up. You developed this approach independently? Wei nodded, uncomfortable under the professor's intense scrutiny. Even more extraordinary, Renault murmured almost to himself. He tapped the papers on his desk thoughtfully. This has implications beyond the problem itself. Your method could potentially be applied to a whole class of similar theoretical questions. Dr. Harmon was beaming now, clearly delighted by this validation of her students' abilities. We need to formalize this, Professor Renault continued, suddenly businesslike. A proper paper for the journal. And of course the university will want to make an announcement. He looked at Wei speculatively. There's a department meeting tomorrow afternoon. I'd like you to present your solution. Wei felt the blood drain from his face. Present? To the entire department? Is that a problem? Renault asked, seemingly genuinely puzzled by Wei's reaction. Before Wei could respond, Dr. Harmon intervened smoothly. Perhaps we could start with something smaller, a session with just a few key faculty members, to help Wei prepare for a larger presentation later. Professor Renault looked as if he might object, but then his expression softened almost imperceptibly. Very well. We'll arrange something more intimate, but make no mistake, Mr. Zhang. He fixed Wei with a penetrating look. "Your work deserves to be shared widely, and you deserve the recognition that comes with it." As they left Professor Renault's office, Wei felt as if he were walking in a dream. Everything around him seemed slightly unreal. The hallway, the students passing by, even Dr. Harmon's reassuring presence beside him. "Are you all right?" she asked as they exited the building. "I think so," Wei said slowly. "It's just a lot to take in." "It is," Dr. Harmon agreed. "But remember, this doesn't change who you are. It just changes what other people can see about you." The next morning, Wei woke to find his phone exploding with notifications. Overnight, Professor Renault had sent an email to the entire mathematics department, revealing Wei as the solver of the infamous problem, and scheduling a special seminar for the following week where Wei would present his solution. Word had spread quickly from there. Students Wei had sat next to for months without ever speaking to him suddenly knew his name. As he walked across campus to his first class, people pointed and whispered. Someone he didn't recognize called out, "There he is!" And a small group of students actually applauded. Wei wanted to disappear, to become invisible again. He hurried to class with his head down, his face burning with embarrassment. But when he slipped into his usual seat at the back of the lecture hall, something unexpected happened. The professor, a stern woman who had never seemed to notice Wei before, paused in her preparations and looked directly at him. "Mr. Zhang," she said, her voice carrying across the suddenly silent room, "we're honored to have such a brilliant mind in our class." A murmur of agreement rippled through the students. Wei felt a strange warmth spreading through his chest, a feeling so unfamiliar that it took him a moment to recognize it. Belonging. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Wei met with Professor Renault daily to prepare for the seminar and to begin work on a formal paper. Dr. Harmon helped him practice his presentation, gently coaching him on how to speak clearly and make eye contact with his audience. Even Henry the janitor stopped him in the hallway to shake his hand, saying proudly, "I knew there was something special about you that night." Wei's roommates, who had previously treated him as little more than furniture, suddenly wanted to know everything about his work. One of them, Lee, a business major with a booming laugh, appointed himself Wei's unofficial publicist, regaling anyone who would listen with increasingly embellished tales of "my roommate, the genius." On the day of the seminar, Wei arrived at the mathematics building to find the lecture hall already full, with people standing at the back and spilling out into the hallway. His steps faltered at the sight, but then he felt a hand on his shoulder. Dr. Harmon was there, steady and encouraging as always. "Just talk to me," she said quietly. "Forget everyone else is here. Just explain the mathematics the way you did in my office." Wei nodded, clutching his notes tightly as they made their way to the front of the room. Professor Renault introduced him with uncharacteristic warmth, describing Wei's solution as a breakthrough that challenges our conventional approaches. And then it was Wei's turn to speak. He stepped up to the podium, his heart hammering so loudly he was sure everyone could hear it. The room fell silent, all eyes on the quiet kid who had shocked the university. We looked down at his notes, then out at the sea of expectant faces. For a terrible moment he couldn't speak at all, but then his gaze found Dr. Harmon in the front row, her expression calm and confident. Beside her sat his roommate Lee, giving him an enthusiastic thumbs up. And in the back, barely visible but unmistakably there, stood Henry the janitor, who had apparently taken his break to attend the seminar. Wei took a deep breath. These people weren't here to judge him. They were here to listen, to learn, to understand what he had discovered, and suddenly Wei wanted to tell them. Not for recognition or acclaim, but because knowledge was meant to be shared, because his solution might open doors for others just as it had for him. "The key insight," he began, his voice soft but growing stronger with each word, came from looking at the problem from a different angle. As he spoke, explaining his approach step by step, Wei felt something shifting inside him. The mathematics flowed naturally, and with it came a newfound confidence. This was his territory. This was where he belonged. By the time he finished his presentation, Wei was no longer the same person who had hesitantly entered Professor Renault's office days before. He was still quiet, still more comfortable with equations than with people, but he had found his voice. The applause that followed was thunderous. Professor Renault was beaming, actually beaming as he stepped forward to shake Wei's hand. Faculty members surrounded him with questions and congratulations. Students who had never noticed him before were suddenly eager to introduce themselves. In the midst of it all, Wei caught Dr. Harmon's eye. She was hanging back, letting him have his moment, but the pride in her expression spoke volumes. She had always seen what others hadn't, had recognized the potential in the quiet student who sat at the back of her class. Wei would be forever grateful for that. Later that evening, as the excitement finally began to die down, Wei sat alone on the same bench where he had talked with Dr. Harmon days earlier. The campus was quiet, the autumn air crisp and cool. Above him, stars pierced the darkening sky, distant and beautiful. His phone buzzed with a text from his parents, who had watched a live stream of his presentation from their small convenience store, closing early for the first time in years to witness their son's achievement. "We are so proud," his father had written. "You walked through the door." Wei smiled up at the stars, feeling a peace he had never known before. He was still the same person, still more comfortable with silence than with noise, still happiest when lost in the elegant patterns of mathematics. But now he had been seen, truly seen, for who he was and what he could do. The quiet kid had found his place in the world not by changing who he was, but by allowing others to see what had been there all along. Wei's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. 3 weeks had passed since his presentation, and still the emails and messages kept coming. Tech companies offering summer internships, research institutions extending invitations to visit, journalists requesting interviews, even a literary agent suggesting a book about his journey from obscurity to mathematical stardom. He sat on his bed, scrolling through the notifications with a mixture of disbelief and growing anxiety. This wasn't what he had wanted. He had solved Renault's problem because the mathematics spoke to him, because he couldn't help but follow where the equations led. He hadn't done it for this. His roommate Lee poked his head into the room. "Hey, math star, there's a package for you at the front desk. Looks fancy." Wei nodded his thanks, trying to return Lee's enthusiastic smile. Lee had been relentlessly supportive, proudly telling anyone who would listen about his genius roommate. Wei appreciated the kindness, but sometimes wished for the invisibility of his former life. The package turned out to be an invitation to a prestigious mathematics conference in New York, complete with a handwritten note from the organizer expressing hope that Wei would present his revolutionary approach. He added it to the growing stack of mail on his desk and sank into his chair, suddenly exhausted. A gentle knock at the open door made him look up. Dr. Harmon stood in the doorway, her expression concerned. "Bad time?" she asked. Wei shook his head. "No, it's fine. Please come in." Dr. Harmon sat on the edge of Wei's bed, taking in the stacks of mail and the dark circles under his eyes. "How are you holding up?" "I'm okay," Wei said automatically, then sighed. "Actually, I don't know. Everything's happening so fast. Fame can be overwhelming," Dr. Harmon said sympathetically, "especially when you're not seeking it." "I just wanted to solve the problem," Wei said quietly. "I never thought about what would come after." Dr. Harmon nodded, understanding in her eyes. "The work matters more than the recognition, I get it. But Wei, what you did has real significance. Your approach opens new pathways for research. That's why everyone is so excited." Wei looked down at his hands. "Professor Renault wants me to present at the International Mathematics Symposium next month." "That's a tremendous opportunity," Dr. Harmon said, then paused, studying his face. "But it scares you. All those people," Wei said, his voice barely audible. "All watching me, judging my work, judging me. They'll be there because they respect your mind," Dr. Harmon said gently. "But if you're not ready, that's okay too. There's no rush, Wei. Mathematics isn't going anywhere." Wei smiled faintly at that. "Try telling Professor Renault. He's already booked my flight." "I'll talk to him," Dr. Harmon offered. "Remind him that even mathematical prodigies need breathing room." After she left, Wei tried to focus on his regular coursework, but his mind kept wandering. It wasn't just the attention that was bothering him, though that was certainly part of it. There was something else, a nagging feeling he couldn't quite identify. Later that evening, while eating dinner alone in a quiet corner of the cafeteria, Wei overheard two graduate students at a nearby table. "Did you read Novak's critique?" one of them asked. "About the Zhang solution?" "Yeah, pretty harsh." Wei froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. I mean, he has a point, the first student continued. The kid's approach is unorthodox. No formal training, no established methodology. Could be a fluke. Or plagiarism, the other suggested. Renaud's been too quick to celebrate. What if this whole thing blows up in the department's face? Fouy set down his fork, no longer hungry. He hadn't heard about any critique. Professor Renaud hadn't mentioned it, nor had Dr. Harmon. He pulled out his phone and quickly searched Novak critique Zhang solution. The results made his heart sink. Dr. Anton Novak, a prominent mathematician from a rival university, had published a scathing analysis questioning the validity of Wei's solution. The article was filled with technical language, but the conclusion was clear. Novak believed Wei's work was either derivative or fundamentally flawed. Wei read the article twice, his hands growing cold. Novak's arguments were sophisticated, challenging aspects of Wei's proof that most people wouldn't even understand. Defending himself would require explaining complex mathematical concepts to an audience that might already be predisposed to believe Novak, the established expert over Wei, the unknown undergraduate. He returned to his dorm room and spent the night going over his solution again and again, checking each step, each inference, each conclusion. By morning, he was confident that his work was sound, but the doubt planted by Novak's critique had taken root in his mind. What if he had missed something? What if everyone realized he wasn't as brilliant as they thought? The next day, Wei arrived at Dr. Harmon's office hours to find Professor Renaud already there. They both looked up when he entered, their conversation halting abruptly. "You've seen the Novak paper," Professor Renaud said. "It wasn't a question." Wei nodded, his throat tight. "Predictable," Renaud said dismissively. "Novak has always been threatened by innovation, particularly when it doesn't come from his own students. The critique is getting attention, though," Dr. Harmon said, her expression troubled. "People are asking questions." "Let them," Renaud declared with uncharacteristic passion. "The mathematics speaks for itself. Wei's proof is sound." Wei looked between them, surprised by Professor Renaud's vehement defense. "You're sure?" "I've reviewed it extensively," Renaud said firmly. "Novak's objections are theoretical smoke and mirrors, designed to cast doubt rather than engage seriously with your work. His reputation gives his words weight, but in this case they lack substance." Wei felt a rush of relief, followed almost immediately by a new wave of anxiety. "What do I do now?" "You defend your work," Renaud said simply. "The International Symposium will be the perfect venue. Novak will be there, along with every other significant name in the field. You'll present your solution, address the criticisms directly, and put this matter to rest." Wei's relief evaporated. Present in front of Dr. Novak and everyone else. "It's the most efficient way to address the controversy," Renaud said, apparently oblivious to Wei's growing panic. "I've already adjusted your presentation time to allow for a more comprehensive explanation." Wei looked desperately at Dr. Harmon, who seemed to understand his distress. "Julian," she said to Renaud, using his first name for the first time in Wei's hearing. "Wei might need some time to prepare for this. It's a lot of pressure." "Time is precisely what we don't have," Renaud replied. "The longer Novak's critique goes unanswered, the more credence it gains." He turned to Wei, his expression softening slightly. "I understand this is challenging, but mathematics requires rigor and defense. Your work deserves to be protected." After Renaud left, Dr. Harmon stayed with Wei, helping him work through his anxiety. "We'll practice," she promised. "Every day if necessary. By the time you reach that podium, you'll be ready." But as the symposium approached, Wei's anxiety only worsened. He began having trouble sleeping, lying awake imagining all the ways his presentation could go wrong. His grades in other classes slipped as he focused obsessively on perfecting his defense against Novak's criticisms. Word of the controversy had spread throughout the university. Some students, particularly those who had been skeptical of Wei's sudden fame, began to echo Novak's doubts. Wei overheard whispers in the library, caught speculative glances in the cafeteria. The isolation he had once sought now felt imposed, a quarantine of suspicion. A week before the symposium, Wei reached his breaking point. After a particularly brutal practice session, where he fumbled through his explanation and couldn't answer one of Renaud's pointed questions, Wei returned to his dorm room and began packing his belongings. Li found him stuffing clothes into a backpack. "What are you doing?" "Going home," Wei said, not looking up. "I'm withdrawing from the university." Lee stared at him in disbelief. Because of that Novak guy? Are you serious? You don't understand, Wei said, his voice strained. Everyone's watching, waiting for me to fail. And maybe I will. Maybe I'm not as smart as they thought. Maybe I just got lucky. That's garbage, Lee said bluntly. And you know it. Wei stopped packing, his hands trembling slightly. What if I freeze up there? What if I can't explain it properly? What if you're amazing and shut everyone up? Lai countered. What if you show Novak and all those other doubters exactly how brilliant you are? I'm not good at speaking in front of people. No, you weren't good at it, Lee corrected. But you've been practicing. Dr. Harmon's been helping you. And anyway, this isn't about being a great speaker. It's about knowing your stuff, which you do.